The champagne was vintage, the linens were crisp white, and the lie was $144,000 deep. My parents stood on the deck, fireworks detonating behind them, unveiling the ultimate wedding surprise, the family lake house for my sister, Elizabeth. The crowd roared at their generosity. I didn't. I glanced at my phone instead. The reminder I had scheduled months ago lit up the screen in the darkness. Balloon payment due, $144,000 in exactly 30 days. They weren't handing her a legacy. They were placing a live grenade in her bouquet. Before we go any further, drop a comment below. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing how far this community reaches. I stepped away from the ovation, the sharp pop of champagne corks dissolving behind me as my heels touched the wooden slats of the dock. The air down here was thick, saturated with the scent of lake water and algae, a bracing contrast to the designer fragrance drifting from the deck above. I needed the darkness. I needed the quiet. Up there, beneath the glowing string lights, my family was staging their greatest production yet, the generous dynasty. Down here, illuminated by the pale glow of my phone, I was reviewing the numbers, and the numbers were hemorrhaging red. I've always been the invisible ledger in this family, the checkbook daughter. Elizabeth was the face, the influencer, the former beauty queen, the trophy collector. I was the one who transferred funds quietly behind the curtain. When Elizabeth wrecked her first car at 19, I wired the deductible so Dad's insurance premiums wouldn't skyrocket. When Mom had her medical emergency last year, which turned out to be a 5-figure cosmetic surgery bill she tried to conceal from Dad, I paid it without a word. I told myself it was loyalty. I told myself I was the dependable one, the structural beam, but staring at the foreclosure notice glowing on my screen, I realized something brutal. I wasn't a pillar. I was a silent investor in a collapsing enterprise. My parents weren't wealthy, they were leveraged. They lived suspended on maxed-out credit cards, revolving lines of credit, and second mortgages disguised as success, the vintage champagne they were toasting with. Likely charged to a card that had hit its ceiling yesterday, and this house, this sprawling, photogenic lake estate passed down for 2 generations, was no longer an asset, it was a liability. A vessel taking on water, they weren't gifting it to Elizabeth out of love. They were handing her the captain's hat seconds before the bridge submerged. I glanced back toward the house. Elizabeth was laughing, spinning in her white dress, a sparkler glittering in her hand. She looked luminous. She also looked defenseless. For the first time in my life, I didn't envy her. I felt a cool, clinical pity. This was the cage of favoritism. They had spent her entire life insulating her from consequence, granting her every wish. And in doing so, they had stripped her of survival instincts. She didn't know how to dissect a contract, identify predatory terms, or endure a winter without a safety net. She believed she was the golden child. In reality, she was the sacrificial lamb, fed praise so she wouldn't hear the blade being sharpened. Years ago, I had caught my mother lying to a neighbor about why we sold our second car. She met my gaze without flinching and said, "Haley, we do what we must to protect the family name. The truth is only useful if it serves us." That was their philosophy. That was the snare hidden inside their good intentions. They genuinely believed that concealing debt equaled protection. But you cannot save someone by handing them an anchor and calling it a life vest. The arithmetic was simple, brutal, indisputable. If Elizabeth signed that deed tomorrow, the debt became hers. The concealed lawsuit settlement, $93,000 buried inside that mortgage, would transfer to her shoulders. They were preserving their own credit by sacrificing hers. It wasn't a wedding present. It was a financial execution order, and I was the only person on that property who knew how to interpret the warrant. The next morning, the kitchen carried the rich scent of expensive espresso and denial. My parents sat at the marble island reviewing wedding RSVPs as if they hadn't publicly announced a fraudulent property transfer to 200 guests the night before. I entered without coffee. I carried the foreclosure notice on my tablet. I didn't shout, I audited. "The balloon payment is due in 30 days, I said, setting the tablet on the cool stone between them. $144,000. If Elizabeth signs that deed, she inherits the debt. You're not giving her a house, you're giving her bankruptcy." My father, Richard, didn't even glance at the screen. He sipped his coffee, wearing an expression of bored disappointment. "Always the accountant, Haley. We're celebrating family joy. And you arrive with spreadsheets to reconcile happiness." "It isn't happiness," I replied evenly. It's math. And the math says you're insolvent. My mother, Lisa, inserted herself smoothly, her tone tight and syrupy. We have a deal closing next month that will resolve everything. Liquidity is fluid. We're securing Elizabeth's future. Why can't you just be happy she's receiving her legacy? Because a legacy shouldn't require a credit check, I said. You're using her credit score to patch the holes in yours. You're jealous, Richard snapped, the mask slipping a fraction. You've always been jealous of her. You work hard, yes. But Elizabeth shines, and you can't tolerate that we're giving her the spotlight. Before I could respond, Elizabeth walked in. She wore a white silk robe, every inch the princess they had engineered. She didn't look at the tablet, she looked at me. Her eyes were cold. Are you still on this? She asked, voice laced with pity. Brandon said you were sulking on the dock last night. Now you're interrogating mom and dad. God, Haley, you're so corporate. You think everything is transactional. Some people receive good things simply because they're loved. The anger in my chest cooled into something forensic. This was the cage of favoritism. They hadn't just indulged her. They had disabled her. By removing every obstacle, they had erased her survival instincts. She was a show horse, polished, beautiful, trained to trot in perfect circles while the stable burned around her. She never questioned them because she never had to. Her privilege functioned as a muzzle. It kept her docile, obedient, blind. She wasn't complicit. She was the ideal victim. I'm not jealous, Liz, I said quietly, retrieving my tablet. I'm terrified for you. Save it, she shot back. I don't need your protection. I have Dad. I met Richard's eyes. A thin, victorious smile curved his lips. He believed he'd won. By positioning the golden child against the scapegoat, he thought his narrative was secure. He miscalculated. He assumed I was still operating under family rules where emotion dictated outcomes. He didn't realize I had shifted to professional protocol, and in my profession, emotions are irrelevant. Evidence is everything. I said nothing more. I turned, left the kitchen, and packed my bags. I was done playing sister. It was time to become an analyst. The drive back to the city was silent except for the low hum of tires on asphalt. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I recalibrated. The daughter seeking approval shut down. The sister craving inclusion powered off. In their place, the forensic analyst came online. This wasn't a family disagreement anymore. It was a case file. And I knew precisely how to build one. Back in my apartment, I assembled my war room. 3 monitors, fresh coffee, access to the public databases I used at work. I began tugging at the threads my father assumed were buried. Property records first. The lake house deed showed a clean transfer to my parents 20 years ago. Standard mortgage followed. Then 3 years ago, a second lien surfaced, $93,600. The interest rate was predatory, the kind you accept only when desperation overrides pride. Next, I investigated the business deal my mother referenced. I pulled the LLC filings for Richard Sterling Consulting. Status, active, revenue, laughable. The company had been hemorrhaging for 5 years. There was no major deal closing next month, only accumulating liabilities, but the true smoking gun wasn't in the business filings. It was in the court records. I searched the county clerk's database under my father's name, filtering for civil litigation. There it was, case number 21 CV943, Peterson v. Sterling. Filed 3 years ago, settled out of court. The plaintiff, a former business partner, had alleged embezzlement of joint venture funds, settlement amount confidential. The timing aligned perfectly with the second mortgage. He hadn't financed a boat, he hadn't renovated a kitchen, he had purchased his freedom. I leaned back, screen light illuminating the dark room. It was worse than negligence. My parents weren't simply irresponsible. They were fugitives from accountability. They had neutralized a fraud allegation with borrowed money. And now they were preparing to transfer that debt to Elizabeth, absolving themselves. If the partner resurfaced, if the IRS initiated an audit, they could declare insolvency. They would gesture toward the house transfer and say, "We have nothing. Our daughter owns the asset." They were positioning her as the fall guy for a crime she didn't even know had occurred. My phone vibrated on the desk. It was a text from Elizabeth. "Please just let it go. You're ruining everything." I stared at the message. She still thought this was about a party. She thought I was being petty, trying to steal her spotlight. She didn't realize I was the only thing standing between her and a felony investigation. I didn't reply. I printed the court docket. I printed the settlement agreement summary. I printed the foreclosure notice. I compiled everything into a single PDF file titled The Truth. This was the trap of their good intentions. My mother had probably convinced herself that hiding this was an act of love. She would say they did it to protect the family name to keep Elizabeth from worrying. It was cognitive dissonance weaponized. They believed that maintaining the image of wealth was more important than the reality of survival. They thought that if they just kept dancing, the music would never stop, but the music had already stopped. The band had packed up and gone home, and the only sound left was the scratching of a pen on a foreclosure deed. I closed my laptop. I had the evidence. I had the motive. Now I just needed the venue. The rehearsal dinner was held in the ballroom of the Grand Hotel downtown, a venue that cost more for one night than my parents had in their combined retirement accounts. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, and the centerpieces were towering arrangements of white orchids. It was beautiful, it was expensive, it was a lie. I arrived late carrying nothing but a slim laptop bag. I had traded my bridesmaid dress for a sharp black suit. Tonight wasn't about blending in, it was about standing out. I scanned the room. My parents were at the head table holding court, basking in the admiration of their guests. Elizabeth was next to them, looking nervous but radiant, holding Brandon's hand. Brandon looked bored, checking his watch clearly, ready for the night to be over. I walked over to Elizabeth first. I had to try one last time, just once for my own conscience. Liz, I said, leaning down to whisper in her ear. We need to talk now outside. She pulled away, her eyes flashing with annoyance. Not now, Haley. Dad is about to give his speech. Don't make a scene. This isn't a scene, it's an intervention. Please, 5 minutes. No, she hissed. Sit down or leave. I looked at her. I saw the fear behind the defiance. She knew something was wrong. She had to feel the tension radiating off our parents, but she was too terrified to look at it directly. She was choosing the comfortable lie over the terrifying truth. And in that moment, I realized I couldn't save her quietly. The infection had spread too deep. The only way to save the patient was to cut it out in front of everyone. I nodded slowly. Okay. I walked to the back of the room, where the AV technician was monitoring the slideshow. I had called ahead using my maid of honor status to get access. Change of plans, I told him, handing him a flash drive. We're going with the updated presentation. Dad's speech needs visual aids. He shrugged and plugged it in. Richard stood up, tapping a spoon against his champagne flute. The room quieted. He smiled. That charming practice smile that had fooled bankers, business partners, and his own children for decades. Friends, family, he began, his voice thick with emotion. Tonight is about legacy, about passing the torch. Lisa and I have built a life, a home, a name, and tomorrow we give the jewel of that legacy, our beloved lake house, to our daughter Elizabeth. It is our gift, our blessing. I hit the space bar on my laptop. The screen behind him, which had been displaying a photo of Elizabeth as a toddler, flickered. Then it changed. It wasn't a baby picture, it was a PDF, notice of default and intent to foreclose. The text was blown up to 10 FT tall, amount due $144,250. The room went deadly silent. Richard stopped mid-sentence, confused by the sudden hush. He turned around. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. I didn't stop. I hit the space bar again. The next slide appeared. Settlement agreement Peterson versus Sterling, the fraud allegations. The settlement amount $93,600. The date 3 years ago. I hit the space bar again. The email from my mother to my father dated 2 months ago. If we transfer the deed before the balloon payment hits, the liability shifts to her. We can claim we gifted it in good faith. It buys us time. I walked to the center of the room. I didn't need a microphone. The silence was loud enough. It's not a legacy, Dad, I said, my voice calm, steady, lethal. It's a liability dump. You aren't giving her a home. You're giving her your debt. You're giving her your fraud settlement. You're giving her a bankruptcy so you don't have to file one yourself. Richard tried to speak to bluster to deny this. This is a misunderstanding. Haley is jealous. She's lying. The documents aren't lying, I said, pointing to the screen. That's the county clerk's stamp. That's the bank's letterhead. That's your signature on the settlement admitting to embezzlement. I turned to Brandon. He was staring at the screen, reading the numbers. He was a tech heir. He knew how to read a balance sheet. He stood up slowly. Is this true? He asked Richard. His voice wasn't angry. It was cold, businesslike. Brandon, son, please let me explain. Richard stammered, sweating now. Is it true? Richard looked at the screen. He looked at the room full of people staring at him with horror. He looked at me and he crumbled. He didn't say yes. He just looked down. Brandon turned to Elizabeth. She was sobbing, looking between the screen and her fiancé, terrified. Did you know? He asked her. No, she wailed. I swear, Brandon, I didn't know. He looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at the dead on the screen. I believe you, he said, but I can't marry into this, my family. We can't be attached to fraud. He took the engagement ring off her finger, not cry, but decisively placed it on the table and walked out. The room erupted. My mother was screaming at me. Elizabeth was on the floor in her white dress crying. My father was slumped in his chair, a broken man. I watched it all. It was a massacre. It was the surgery of truth. I had just cut off the limb to save the body. It was bloody, it was painful, and it was absolutely necessary. I packed up my laptop. My work here was done. The fallout was swift, brutal, and total. The wedding was canceled the next morning. Not postponed, canceled. Brandon's family, who had built their fortune on tech patents and impeccable due diligence, cut ties immediately. They threatened to sue my father for misrepresentation if he tried to contact them again. My parents' social circle, the one they had mortgaged their future to impress, evaporated overnight. The fraud settlement was no longer a secret. It was the headline of every whispered conversation at the country club they could no longer afford. Elizabeth showed up at my apartment 3 days later. She looked like a ghost. Her perfect hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wasn't wearing makeup. For the first time in her life, she didn't look like an influencer. She looked like a survivor of a natural disaster. They're selling the lake house, she said, her voice. The bank is taking it. Dad is liquidating his retirement to pay off the rest of the settlement debt so he doesn't go to jail for tax evasion. I nodded. I know, I saw the listing. She sat on my couch, pulling her knees to her chest. I hated you. You know, when you put that slide up on the screen, I wanted you to die, I know. But then Brandon left and Dad didn't stop him. Dad just sat there and let him walk away because he knew he was caught. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. He wasn't going to tell me, was he? He was going to let me sign the deed the next morning. He was going to let me ruin my life so he could keep his membership at the club. Yes, I said softly, he was. She started to cry, a quiet, broken sound that hurt more than the screaming match at the rehearsal dinner. This was the cage of favoritism finally breaking open. The golden child realized she wasn't the prize, she was the currency. I went to my desk and pulled out a folder. It wasn't an indictment this time, it was a lifeline. I handed it to her. What is this? She asked, wiping her eyes. It's a budget, a real one, and a list of recruiters I know who place entry-level marketing roles based on skill, not connections. It's a plan, Liz, for independence. She took the folder. She looked at it like it was a foreign object, then looked at me. Why are you helping me? I treated you like garbage. Because you're my sister, I said, and because the only way to beat them is to survive them. You don't need a rich husband or a lake house to be okay. You just need to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. 6 months later, I met Elizabeth for coffee. She was working as a junior coordinator at a PR firm. The pay wasn't great, and she lived in a studio apartment with 2 roommates, but she paid her own rent. She looked tired, but she looked real. Mom called me yesterday, she said, stirring her latte. They moved into a condo in Jersey. She complained for 20 minutes about the lack of closet space. I smiled. Did you offer to send money? Nope, she said, a small, proud smile touching her lips. I told her to try the Container Store and then I hung up. We sat there in the busy cafe, the noise of the city around us. There was no fireworks display, no champagne, no applause. Just 2 sisters drinking coffee, finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. I picked up the check, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I had walked through the fire to get here. I had been the villain, the prosecutor, and the executioner, but looking at my sister free from the debt that would have drowned her, I knew I would do it all again. I had burned down the fantasy to save the reality, and the reality was worth saving. If you've ever had to be the villain to save someone you love, share this story and tell me in the comments what's the hardest truth you've ever had to tell. Don't forget to follow for more stories about breaking free.